Well, welcome everybody. This is Geoff Perlman. I'm the founder and CEO of Xojo, and today's webinar is creating web services in Xojo. And I'm here with Ricardo Cruz, who's one of our software engineers whose primary responsibility is the web framework. Ricardo? Seems like his audio is not working. One moment. Okay, well, we're going to continue on. We'll figure that out later. Anyway, so we're going to talk about creating web services. And if you have any questions, there's a Q&A panel. Type them in there. We'll get to them at the end. I think Ricardo will be answering some of them as we go on. Save some for the end as well. In terms of what we'll be covering, we're going to be talking about what is a web service, calling a web service, responding to a call to a web service, there's both sides of that, sending and receiving data, web service request verbs. This is some of the syntax that is expected when you're building a web service. Handling web services that are very time consuming. Calling web services from apps when you make the app in Xojo itself. The client app, I should say. Scaling a web service if you need to do that. Whether you should be using a Xojo Web App to build your web service or a console app. We'll talk about that. A little bit about security. And then finally, standardizing your web service API. Okay, so what is a web service? Well, a web service basically is an app running on a server that will respond when called via an HTTP URL over a network. That's the most generic way of describing a web service. Now, if you have never built a web service before or used one, you probably have at least heard the term REST before. And what REST stands for is representational state transfer. Typically, this means it's a stateless application or web service. You're sending a request, and the response, if there is one, is usually HTML, XML, JSON, but it could be an image. It could be just about anything, really. But it's usually stateless. So it means that there's nothing being kept as state on the server, unless you're, for example, using a database. In that case, you know, the state could be in the database, but as part of the protocol, it's stateless. Now, basically, there are two parts to a web service. There's making a request and there's responding to that request. So let's first talk about making a request. So a request, basically at its most basic components, it's broken down into a URL, a /, and a path. For me, I think of the path as being like a method call in Xojo. That's the best way to think about it. For example, let's say I had a website called dogs.com and I wanted to have it, you know, have a way for someone to get a random picture of a dog. Now, web services are often in a subdomain. So in this case, my subdomain is find, and my path or method call is random. You know, give me a random dog picture, for example. So you can also have parameters. Parameters are then at the end, there's a question mark followed by your parameters. For example, here's our random dog web service again, and we have a parameter of size that has a value of big. You can also have multiple parameters. So you separate those with an ampersand. You can have pretty much as many as you want. And those are the components. Now, you need to be able to obviously respond to a request. And this is where we get into the Xojo side of things, because on the request side, the request could conceivably be coming from anywhere. It could be coming from a browser. It could be coming from, you know, a mobile application, another web server, a desktop application, just about anywhere. So how do you respond to a request? Well, first of all, The way you respond can be text, it can be images, it can be JSON. Again, almost any kind of response. If it's data, you can probably respond to a request with it. And in a web application written in Xojo, that's done via the handle URL event. So let's dig into that a bit. So handle URL gets two parameters, the request, the incoming request, and you're passed a response, which is a web response object. And this is where you're going to this is the object you're going to populate to provide the response that's going to go back. Now, if you are sending a response back, then you need to indicate that by passing true to this event. It's kind of like if you've ever done used the mouse events in a desktop app, you have to, in mouse down, you have to respond true to get a mouse up. Well, it's the same thing here. If you want the response to be sent back, then you need to respond true. So looking at this request, the path is here, and the web request has two properties. It has path and query string. So the path property of the web request will be this value, in this case, random. And the query string property will have the parameters. So that's how you access those. That's one way anyway. Now, when you respond, and I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff about these, and then we'll look at an example. But when you respond, if you're just sending text back, then you can use the web response object's write method, and you literally just put in your string and say write, and that data will be sent back. Now, depending on the client, you may want to set the MIME type. For example, let's say the client is a web browser and you're sending back HTML, then you probably want to set the MIME type to text HTML. If it's just plain text, you can set it to plain text. If it's JSON that the client application is expecting to do something with, not just display it, but actually process it, then you use application/JSON. Now, if you're responding with an image, then it's actually pretty easy. The web response object has a file property. You assign the folder item that represents the file to that property, and then set the MIME type. If it's a PNG, it's image/PNG. If it's a JPEG, image/JPEG. These are standard MIME types. There are a lot more. If you want to look up specific MIME types, if you just Google common MIME types, then that'll take you to the documentation page at Mozilla, which will describe all of them. You'll get a big long list, and you can see which ones are appropriate. I figured this was easier than giving you a URL. You can just Google that and take you right to it. Now, when you're sending and receiving data, there'll be times when you need to be thinking about the format of that data. For example, in your URL, there are lots of characters that aren't legal. You can't use a white space. You can't use a double quote, a single quote, ampersand, %, and many others. So when you're putting your URL together, you'll need to encode some of that, specifically the path and the parameters. And you can do that if you're doing it from within an app you're writing in Xojo using encode URL component. That's a global method you can use. And on the other side, in some cases, and we'll talk about those, you can use the alternate method decode URL component. And I've got a quick little demo just so you can see what this looks like. So I'm going to switch over here and let's get to my example. Let me run this. Okay, so let's say I type in a word. This is my original word. And when I press the button, it's going to encode that word with encode URL component and then decode it with decode URL component. Now, in this case, there's nothing illegal. So you can see you get the exact same text all the way through. But if I say this is a test with an exclamation mark, well, that's got illegal characters in it. So you can see how it's encoded. And then when that string is decoded, you get back the original. So it's that part of it is actually really, really straightforward. Okay, so for a web request, some things you have to encode, decode, and some things are automatic. For example, the path property. If you are getting the path to know what the user is calling, because your web service might be providing lots of different methods. I mean, that's really what I think of when I think of a web service. I think of it as basically just an application with one or more methods that I can call. So to figure out which method is being called, you're typically going to look at the path property. You'll need to decode that with decode URL component. That's just to get back the legal string that the user sent. Same with the query string. If you're using that property, you'll need to decode it with decode URL component. However, you can actually use the web request parameter method and just pass it the name of the parameter you're expecting, and it will be decoded automatically. So that's actually really nice. That way you don't have to mess with decoding it at all. And you don't have to parse it, because you can just say, hey, I want the parameter called this or the parameter called that. So parameters is a nice way to deal with that and avoid having to worry about decoding it. Same is true for the header method. If you're using headers, that's automatic as well. And the write method, when you're sending data back and you do it via write, it automatically encodes it for you. You don't have to do anything there. Okay, so when you are calling a web service or providing one, there are certain verbs that web services they're sort of standard. Now, you could use anything you want, but these particular verbs are part of the standard way a web service is put together. It's not required, but if you want your web service to follow the standard kind of API, then this is something you'll want to do. They're assigned you'll find them rather in the method property of the web request. And let's take a look at what they look like. So the first one is get, and get will be used when you're just getting a response to something that doesn't modify the server in any way. A good example is, search results. If the web service is searching a database and the user's called a search method of some kind, and you're just doing a search and providing results back, get is the appropriate method to set there. Post is for creating something new on the server. So, for example, if you're adding a file to the server, if you're adding a new record to a database, that's where post would be used. Put is for updating the server, something on the server. You're updating a file, updating your record in a database, that sort of thing. So these are common methods method names that people that are consuming web services will expect to be passing to you. And finally, delete, when you're deleting something from a server. This could be a file, it could be deleting a record in a database, that sort of thing. Again, there's nothing that validates these. It's really up to you. But if you want your web service to seem like a standard web service, then it's a good idea to see if the user is passing in the appropriate method or request verb, and then respond accordingly. Okay, so some web services that you build might be time consuming, and that's something that you need to think about. Usually web services, the response is pretty quick, but you might have one that's going to be time consuming. And the problem with the time consuming web service is that if it takes too long to respond, the client app, whatever it is, might time out. So if you're in that situation where the web service is going to take, I don't know what would be the longest time before it would be considered a timeout, but maybe 30 seconds or something, then this is something you need to think about. And in that case, you really have two options. If it's a desktop or a mobile app, then you might want to do polling. Basically, what that means is you call the web service to get it started, and then you occasionally call it again to get a status update to see if it's done. Like maybe it's parsing some big file, right? And so you occasionally call it and say, hey, are you done yet? And when it's finally done, then you call a third call typically to get a result. And the reason you do this, especially on mobile, is that with a mobile app, you really can't stay connected for very long. The mobile operating systems, if they see something that is maintaining the connection too long, it'll just cut it off. So that doesn't work. So you need to do polling. Now, if the web service is being called by another web server, on the other hand, in that case, you can do a callback. Basically, when you call the web service, you give it a URL for your app, for your web app, and you say, hey, when you're done, just call this URL. So that's the most efficient way to do it when the client is another web app. Okay. Okay. Ricardo is saying I need to give him permission to talk. I didn't have to do that before, but let me do that real quick. There we go. Okay, Ricardo, you're there?
Hello, everyone. I'm
Yeah,
Ricardo
sorry
Cruz,
about that.
No problem, no problem. Thank you.
I usually set that up beforehand, and I didn't this time. So
Yeah.
anyway, all right. So when you're calling web services from apps made with Xojo, so this is where the client app itself is made with Xojo, then you have two options, and they are to do it synchronously or asynchronously. This is through the URL connection class. If you want a synchronous call, then you use send sync. And basically, these have almost identical parameters, just one's synchronous and one's not. So send sync will do it synchronously, which basically means it's going to wait for a response and then give you the response. Or if you want to do it asynchronously, which is what you'd typically do if you want your you want your UI to remain responsive, or if it's a mobile app, you call send, and then the response comes back in an event. And the event is either going to be content received, if the web service is like using the right method, for example, or file received if it's sending a file. So if you're building the client app in Xojo, then those are your options. With you'll use URL connection, and you either do it with send sync or send. Now, scaling a web service. Scaling a web service is actually really straightforward. You can do it with load balancing, because typically with a web service, you're just making a call and getting a response. There's no state involved. So thus, a load balancer can scale up a web service quite nicely. And if you do have some kind of state involved, you're typically storing that in a database. So you're going to go look that data up each time. And so in a sense, that's almost stateless as well, at least in terms of the web service. So scaling is actually really straightforward. Now, is it better to build your web service in a Xojo web app or in a console app? And I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo to answer that question. Ricardo?
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. You can actually create a web service using a console application using server sockets and raw TCP sockets, but that will take a lot of time to make it right. So your web is already a console application, and we take care of all of the HTTP protocol complexities, like reusing sockets to make it more performant, and some security measures. Well, the best part is also that when you use a Xojo web application, you can just press on deploy button and use our Xojo cloud service, and we will take from there.
Yeah, so basically the Xojo Web App is going to take care of a truckload of responsibility, or complexity rather, for you, that a console app, you'd just be left to do it yourself. Right?
Yeah, and actually for the next release, we are working on performance, and we are seeing in our benchmarks that it will be like 4 to 5 times faster, and you won't have to do anything. You
That's great.
have to, yeah, you just have to upgrade the Xojo version, and that's all.
So, Ricardo, would there be any reason you can think of? I mean, probably 99% of users would just build a web app, but is there any reason to use a console app? I mean, I want to remind everybody, a web app really is a console app behind the scenes, right? But can you think of any reason that someone would need to go to all that trouble to use a console app?
No, but probably if you really need something really custom for your application business, I don't know. Yeah, you have the option to create
Right.
the web service using a server socket.
Right. Okay. But you could prototype, even if you're in that situation, you could prototype the whole thing as a web app first.
Yeah, totally,
okay.
totally.
Yeah. So you always have the option if you found the need. But again, it's probably going to be 1% of people, if even that. 1/10 of 1% of people that need to do that. So a Xojo web app works really well. Okay. All right. Now, so far, everything we've been talking about has been about web services in general. And if your web service is a public web service, which means really anyone can use it, then you don't really have to think as much about security. But if there's private data that's being exchanged in your web service, then you do have to think about security. You have to think about authentication, for example. The user has to be able to, provide some way of indicating that they're a valid user. And then every request that goes back and forth between all the communication needs to be use cryptographic signing. So this can get a little complicated. It uses something called JSON Web Tokens, and I'm just going to show you a little piece of this. Ricardo is going to put together a better demo that you'll be able to incorporate more easily into your web apps. But I want to just quickly show you an example of what happens behind the scene here. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so basically what the client is going to be passing in as a header, that's what you see here, and a payload. In this case, we got their username and some other information. And then there's, what do you call this? The key, basically, Ricardo?
Yeah, it's going to be the key to make the signature of the header and the payload. So
in this little example project, when I click generate token, it generates this string. This is the token. And this token is broken into 3 parts. There's a period separating them. So this is the first part. Oops, this is the first part. And then there's the middle part, which goes to here. And then the last part, which is here. And essentially, it's encrypted versions of each of these sections. This first part is the header. The middle part is the payload, and the last part is the whole thing, correct, Ricardo?
Yeah. The only thing I want to make it clear that this is not encrypted. If you decode this base 64, it will be plain text. The only thing that you are doing is doing a signature of this request.
Right, to validate that it is valid.
The content is what should be. Yeah.
And with this example, you can see that if I change anything about this, right, it immediately checks it and says, oh, that's no longer valid, right? So, so this example shows you how to generate a token and then validate the token. But what we're going to try to do for next week is we're going to make one that is a client and a web service so that you can have it in a context where you can start being able to use it in your own applications. And you will find that here. When you make a new project, you go to examples, go to communications, internet, web services, and you'll find it in that folder. It's not there now. We'll have it there next week. But I think that'll be a lot easier for you to use if you're building a web service that is got private data, that's not a public web service, essentially. If you want to learn more about how security is handled Go to oauth.com. They've got all kinds of documentation on it if you're really into that sort of thing. For me, I just want to have the methods and call them. I don't need to know how it all works behind the scenes. But if you're interested, that's where you'll find that.
Yeah, and they have a lot of documentation about the different combinations, like, for example, a web service talking to a mobile application, or a web service talking to another web service. So there are a lot of combinations, and they expose the framework for each of them.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that this is an area that we have it on our internal list of things we want to look at. This is an area where we could definitely provide more value in the framework for it to handle a lot of this just for you automatically. So know that that's on our list of things to do, our very long list of things to do. There's always something new. That's one thing that never changes at Xojo, because technology is always moving forward. There's always new stuff to do. We never find ourselves twiddling our thumbs. There's always a much longer list of things we want to do than we can do. Okay, and before we get to some demos, standardizing your web service API. So most web services are public, and because of that, people that use them get used to the APIs having a standard convention. And the more you stick to the standard convention, the easier it's going to be for people to use your API. And the way to learn about that standard convention is at openapis.org. You can go there and it will explain to you. And this is basically about how you name things, your path, your parameters, responding, that sort of thing. And Ricardo, you mentioned that if you do this, it can help the user build the client app. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, if you define your API using this open API protocol, then you can send it to your users, and they can generate a client application for your API directly using that schema. It will generate all the files on a lot of languages.
Great. So that generation that happens at openapis.org. They have a service. Okay.
They have a service called Swagger. I think that from there you can just generate your client. But at least the most important thing is that you can create your schema from that tool. It's pretty easy to use.
That's great. Okay, so let's look at a quick demo. I've got a simple web service here because the complexity of what the service does isn't really important. It's just understanding how it works. So we're in a web application. We're in the handle URL event. You can see that it's being passed a request and a response. And in this case, I've made it very simple. I'm just looking at the path of the request to see if it says hello. And if it does, then it's going to write some simple HTML to display hello and the person's name. I'm going to pass a name. So there's going to be a parameter called name, and I'm using the parameter method to get, or property method rather, to get that, and add an exclamation mark and write it back. And because I'm doing this from a browser, I'm going to set the response status to 200, indicating that all went well. I didn't get anything wrong. If something came in wrong, let's say that parameter is missing, then I could send back an appropriate response status code so that the client would know, oh, I did something wrong, right? So I'm going to run this. Okay, and all right, so let's make another tab. And okay, so I'm obviously running this locally, right? So I've got my URL, / and I'm going to put hello. And I tested this before. So you can see what the syntax looks like. There's my path. And then we've got the question mark, and there's just one parameter, name equals Geoff. So hit that, and there it is, hello, Jeff. So it called the web service. The web service got the path, the method name is the way I like to think of it, and the parameters, and it extracted that, generated some HTML, and sent it back. So we can go back and take a look at that, and it's really that simple. Now, if your web service is going to have lots of different methods, different things it can do, then you'd probably have like a select case statement that looks at the path and just says, okay, if it's this method, here's all the things I want to do, and if it's that method, etc. And then with each method, you can use the parameter method to go and get the parameters that are specific to that method. So you can genericize this in a way, and then just keep building it out bigger and bigger. And of course, basically anything you can do in a web app, practically you can do here. Anything you can do with a language. So you can have classes and modules and all that stuff involved. I'm keeping this really simple just so that you can see the basic components of it. But that's really about all there is to it. Ricardo, is there anything you can think of that they would want to know about beyond that? I mean, I think at an introductory level, that's pretty much.
Yeah, essentially, it's as easy as this. But yeah, you can start validating the request, checking the JWT token that we've seen before, and depending on the path, you can give a different status response. I don't know. You can complicate it as much as you want.
Yeah, as much as you want.
This is the basics.
Yeah. So now this is using the browser, but the web client could be, again, another web application. It could be a mobile app. It could be a desktop app. I've written one like that where the clients, I've got a web service, but the clients are actually a desktop or a mobile app. So in which case, like I said earlier, you're using URL connection in that case. But that's basically it. Now let's see. I guess, did we get any questions? Wow, no questions, really. Are we that good? If you have any questions, this would be a good time to ask them. If you don't, that's okay too. But you can use the Q&A panel. We'll give it a moment, see if anyone has any questions. I really intended this to be an introduction, so hopefully we've covered everything. The big thing for me is if it's going to be private, then that means you do need to worry about security. And I think that the example we'll put together for you will take care of most of that, because that's just understanding how to authenticate and how to deal with cryptographic signing. But again, I think we can provide a pretty good example to make that really simple for you. Oh, okay. So we've got a few questions. Okay. Let's see. So Dave Cox is asking, how do I transfer a file down to the user like a PDF file? Okay. That's actually really straightforward. There's the web response has a file property, and it's a folder item. So all you do is you assign the file, PDF file, whatever, to that file property. And when you return true, then the response will get sent back with that file included. So yeah, it's literally, David, as easy as assigning a file to a property, basically.
Yeah, and Geoff, this is another reason to use a Xojo Web application, because otherwise, if you use a server socket, you will have to deal with all that manually. And Xojo Web is already taking care of it.
Yeah, I think what we could say is that there's probably no reason you're ever going to do this with anything but a Xojo Web application. If it would be so ridiculously rare that you would ever need to not do that. And a Xojo Web application handles so much of the communication for you that there's just not a good reason. I don't even think the performance would necessarily even be better. So, Juiced is asking about, he's complaining because I'm going too fast. I apologize. I am talking pretty fast, but we're recording this, so you'll be able to watch it again on YouTube later. In terms of a sample service and a client, yeah, we can provide that. I think the example that Ricardo's going to put together for next week will essentially be that. We're not going to build a complicated service because that's not the point. Really the point is just to be able to connect and make a call and, maybe 2 calls and see, different parameters and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's about it. David is asking, is handle URL multi-threaded, i.e. can it handle many users at once, or do we need to run threads on the server? Ricardo, do you want to talk about that?
We are using threads internally, but they are still cooperative threads like any other Xojo application. But I think that's being talked about in the forum, and it's isn't necessarily a bad thing. Everyone is doing the same. They are all using a single thread for handling all the sockets and creating callbacks for those requests, and they are handling everything in the single thread. And whenever they want to make something that it really needs to be faster and needs to be processed in another thread, you can create another helper console application that will help you to do that.
So it sounds like basically you start with handle URL, and chances are that's going to take care of it. And if it doesn't, then there are optimizations you can do, again, using helper apps and things like that. But probably in most cases, handle URL by itself is going to be good enough.
Yeah, and we will continue improving it behind the scenes, and you will have to just upgrade the Xojo version to get those.
Yeah, and again, you can use load balancing. So if it's a question of how much traffic you're getting, the nice thing about web services is they're actually typically usually, very easy to handle via a load balancer. So that's something to keep in mind. And we have that built into Xojo Cloud as well. So that's something to think about. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions. Again, in summary, essentially, a web service is it's a web application that you can pass. I like to think of it as you can pass it methods and method names and parameters, and then have it simply get the method and say, which method is this? Oh, this is one. I recognize that method, and I'm expecting these parameters. You can use the parameter method to get the parameters, and then you just do whatever logic you're going to do and assign values back to the web response that's been provided. I mean, it's really that easy. I mean, I thought that when I first started looking at web services, before I knew anything about them, they seemed really mysterious to me. And then when I learned about them, I discovered, oh, well, they're actually not that big of a deal, which is great. I think the most complex part is when you're doing a private web service, because then you have to deal with security. But hopefully the example application that, or example projects that Ricardo is going to put together will take some of that mystery away as well. And I think in the future, we'll be building some stuff in so that, we can make the security part of it, as easy as it can be made. I mean, that's one of the things that I feel like do really well at Xojo, is taking things that are complex and make them really, really simple. And the handle URL and web application and web request and web response is a great example of that. I mean, I almost feel like it would have been better to start off showing you guys how you'd have to do it in a console app, because you'd see, oh my gosh, this is really, really complicated. But a Xojo Web App with handle URL and web request and web response makes it really, really easy. So, well, with that, looks like we don't have any more. Oh, wait, there's one more question. Sorry, I had to scroll down. David is asking, if you need to get a login token and send your password over the internet, and you're using HTTPS, is that secure? It turns out that you don't send your username and password as part of the URL. You add it as a header, and and that keeps it secure. You do want to, of course, do this over HTTPS, but I think the example project that Ricardo is going to put together will demonstrate that better than I can explain it. So, yeah, you do have to make sure it stays secure, and that project will show you how to do that. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, we really appreciate y'all coming. We'll keep doing these webinars. I want to tell you, if you have an idea for something you think would make for a good webinar, contact us. We're always interested in hearing the topics that you'd like us to cover in these webinars. So definitely reach out to us. We're really interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And thank you for coming. Until next time, see you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.